My name is Paul Edgar. I work at the Clements Center for National Security, and welcome to our event today. Our panel discussion titled Striking the Ayatollah, War Powers, Political Order, and Consequences. As a preliminary, I simply ask that you refrain from disrupting this event out of respect for our guests and also respect for our audience. If you do interrupt the event, you'll be politely but firmly escorted out. This event is hosted by the Clements Center for National Security, the Strauss Center for International Security and Law, and the Intelligence Studies Project, a joint initiative of the Clements and Strauss Centers. Perhaps, and I've just got about 2 minutes worth of an opening thought before I introduce the panelists and turn it over to them. But perhaps, especially in times of crises and high emotions, it's worth taking a moment to remember our mission here at the university and the mission of those of us who are embedded at the university. Our job is to learn and to educate, to grow in knowledge and transmit that knowledge, and that's what this session is about. We aren't here to condemn an administration, nor to lionize an administration. We are almost uniformly career public servants with scholarly credentials. As Americans, we want the foreign policies of this administration and all of our elected administrations to be successful. So we are here to, as best we can in 75 minutes, dissect this event, its origins, its boundaries, its scope, and the ways that it may end. We hope that we model what it looks like to think critically. I like to tell my students that every war generates a life of its own once it is started, once it's let loose. One of the tricks of war is to know as soon as possible exactly what kind of war it is that you are in, and armed with that knowledge, what it will take to secure goals that are achievable and consistent with American interests and American political life. Our knowledge and assessments here of the panelists are offered out of more than a collective century and a half of experience and scholarship. Consequently, we hope that at the end you have learned a few things and that you can better judge for yourself what has happened and where it may lead. Our panelists are, and I'll start from mostly from your left to right, although I'll flip-flop one of them. I didn't get ahead of things and get everybody seated the way my list reads. So first, Paul Pope, former CIA case officer with experience in the Middle East and the Indian subcontinent. Most senior role was Chief of Training and Tradecraft with CIA. Adam Klein, director of the Strauss Center, on faculty at Texas School of Law. And before joining us, Adam was the Senate-confirmed chairman of the United States Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. General Vince Brooks. Normally when we introduce General Brooks, we highlight his most senior commands, plural, in Korea. But for today, we want to highlight that General Brooks was commander of U.S. Army Central and Third Army, frequently referred to in short as RCENT, the land component of our combatant command, Central Command. He was the RCENT commander, in fact, when the plan that the United States is executing now was first designed and rehearsed. Of course, it's certainly gone through probably a few updates since then, but he was there at the beginning. Steve Slick, former CIA case officer with experience in the Middle East. He was station chief at Tel Aviv, previous special assistant to the president, and the senior director for intelligence programs and reform on the staff of the National Security Council. And our moderator today, Alexandra Sukalo, director of the Intelligence Studies Project and an assistant professor here at the LBJ School. Before earning her PhD in history from Stanford, she spent many years of service as an intelligence officer with NGA and CIA. And I'll turn that over now to Dr. Sukalo.
Thank you so much, Dr. Edgar, and thank you for being here today. I want to just go over the format. We're going to let each of the panelists have about 10 minutes to talk, and then I'm going to lead a few moderated questions, and then we're going to open it up for audience questions. So please think of them as our panelists speak. Professor Pope, let's start with you. Can you kind of set the scene for us of how we got to this moment?
Okay, I will try to do that, and I'm going to depend on my notes more than I normally do. Most of you that have heard me know I don't usually do that too much, but there's a lot of ground to cover, and I want to make sure I cover it properly. So I'm very familiar with the events and policies leading up to this date. I was on a task force, we were just talking about it a minute ago, in the 87, 88 timeframe when we were reflagging American ships. This was at the National Security Council, going down there to the National Security Council. And so it's been a long journey to get here. So I'm supposed to say, well, how did we get here? And I guess the theme that I want to start with is the where are we now and how did we get here question is usually posed. The purpose of that is to sort of set up the rest of the discussion to talk about, where we're going and how this might play out. And I would just make the point that I have the term I've come up with, I call it a blue force analytic problem. And by that, what I mean is that when a conflict involves the United States, evaluating the likelihood of outcomes requires knowing what we're trying to do and how we plan to do it. I understand the operational tactical side of what we're doing very well, and I have great confidence in our forces' ability to do it. But I'm still not certain about our desired end state. And there's several options that it could be. One option is a military campaign to eliminate all offensive capability and knock the Iranian nuclear program back. And the other option is regime change to try to create some kind of stable government. And then there's sort of a hybrid where you decapitate but don't worry about creating a stable government and see what happens. And I'm not really sure which one of those here's we find ourselves in right now on the U.S. side. So with that giant caveat, let me turn to characterizing how we got here and focus more on the Iranian side. For almost 5 decades, various U.S. administrations have watched Iran pursue a focused, unrelenting policy of resistance. I'm going to use resistance as a shorthand. It's a term that they use to the U.S., to the existing world order, and to the existence of the State of Israel. Their military operations, their alliances, their political and diplomatic initiatives shifted and were fluid during this period. But the regime's identity and their purpose was remarkably constant during those decades. It's kind of blows my mind just as looking at some of my students out here to think about the fact that when I was your age, we were still sort of describing Iran in the same way that we are now. Even when blustering and proclaiming resistance, however, as a narrative, the regime became progressively more keenly aware of their relative weaknesses in conventional forces and their economic strength. So they pulled off this amazing balancing act, and it was based on both very clever strategic analysis and orchestration of their situation, paying a lot of attention to us, and then it was also shaped by what I'll call Darwinism. And those were times when they acted in such a way that we took forceful steps to push them back and kind of remind them of the hard realities of hard power. And so it was kind of shaped by, and we have evolved. It's what I'm trying to get at is I think we evolved over a number of decades into this constant competition, probing one another, with the Iranians being expert at avoiding crossing certain lines. The consequences for the region have been pretty terrible for particular countries in the region. Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, they all have their own problems. Iran didn't create all the problems, but they worsened them, and especially in all 3 of those. It was if you compare where Abu Dhabi, to stick to the theme of when I was your age, Abu Dhabi and Dubai were when I was your age. And if you compared the beautiful cities of Beirut and Damascus, which were highly educated populations with a lot of things going for them and where they could be today, I think the Iranians have played a really negative role in the development of the Middle East, not to mention, mass atrocities, large refugee flows, et cetera, with great long-term consequences and regional consequences. I mean, we could go off the subject here and talk about whether Syrian refugee flows is why the Brits left, the EU. So it's been an amazingly long and constant struggle. As recently as 3 or 4 years ago, you could have come into this auditorium and heard a presentation on Iran's proxy forces. And now I'm going to switch to a little bit of an editorial. And I think we described those proxy forces and that situation as it was sort of like just an inevitable part of the current international scene. So, for example, when the Iranians were supporting the Houthis in firing missiles at ships, we sort of treated it as if we knew that was happening, and we talked about it happening, but we retaliated mainly against the Houthis. And so I feel that over those decades, and I don't have time to talk about it except maybe during questions, but if you go back all the way to the period on that task force I was on with the on the reflagging, it was run by Undersecretary Armacost. If you go all the way back to time, you'll see situations in where we're kind of going into a tit-for-tat mode as opposed to a real deterrent mode, I think. And you could, I'd have to support that offline because we don't have time for it. I guess what I'm trying to say is to make an analogy to like human relationships. I think in some ways we became codependent with Iran. And if you don't know what codependency is, if you have a drunk uncle that comes to Christmas and nobody says anything to him because they don't want to make a scene, that's codependency, okay? It's like it's not worth the cost of intervening. And so I'm not blaming us. Don't hear me saying that I'm blaming us for that. But I'm saying that I think there was an element of that. Our preferred tool of punishment has been economic sanctions recently, or in the last decade or so. And they have actually been very effective at hurting the Iranian economy, almost completely ineffective at shaping the policy of the regime. And so that's the only exception to this, or a big exception to this in terms of them kind of keeping the boundaries set, was the death of Qasem Soleimani in 2020. So let me be clear. I'm not saying that we should have done what we're doing now long ago. What I'm saying is that we are doing what we're doing now because we did not shape the space of acceptable Iranian conflict earlier. We did not create deterrence and red lines that we meant. And now we have crossed those, and it's pretty hard to see how we go back. I think there were times when we did knock them back. When we hit the nuclear program last summer, it did not result in this situation that we're in now. And when we sank most of their Navy the first time in the late 80s, it did not lead to a broader war, but it did change their behavior in the Straits. There have been hardline administrations and not hardline administrations during that period. So what I'm describing is that I'm basically saying that before gray zone was a buzzword in the national security arena, they were operating in the gray zone very effectively. And I think we've broken out of that, and this is the part I'll very quickly cover what I think has changed in the last year or so. First, I think one of the things that changed that was technology. And what I'm specifically talking about is layered air defense systems that changed the calculus for Israel when they were calculating their strike options. In my opinion, they went from this is sort of possibly unacceptable cost to greater and greater confidence that they could manage what the Iranians could throw at them. And that I think that changed their calculus. The second thing, and a huge one, not second in priority, is the attack by Hamas in October 2023. That rewrote Israel's calculations about not only Hamas, but all of Iran's proxies. After 9/11, a lot of people we talked about, like, why didn't we believe bin Laden? He told us what he wanted to do. We didn't believe him. After October 7th, a lot of Israelis talked about why did we forget the Hamas charter? And I think that October 7th is important, not only because the Iranians were sort of indirectly culpable in the attacks, but also because I think the Israelis and U.S. administrations are saying, well, when they say death to Israel, death to America, and they work on the nuclear capabilities, should we maybe believe them? The third thing, like the development of the air defense system, when the Israelis virtually decapitated Hezbollah, it was similar in the sense that it changed their calculations. A tool the Iranians had for retaliation was sort of taken away from them. Fourth reason requires imagining sort of a different story, and this is kind of a weird one. Don't think I'm saying we shouldn't have done what we did with Soleimani. That's a separate debate. But Soleimani was the manager of the proxies. Keeping them in that box was what he did. He was really good at that. And I don't know if the Iranians really knew what was going to happen on October 7th. If they did, it's one of the greatest strategic miscalculations in history, in my opinion. And I just wonder, we'll never know how that would have gone if Soleimani had still been around. when Israel struck last summer in the air war that happened last summer, this is the fifth thing, they devastated their air defense system. So it's a lot easier to go back now for us and for them than it was previously. And finally, the Russians are pretty busy right now. So those are the reasons, in my opinion, that we've had like 47 years almost of this kind of stable situation, and now it's not stable.
Thank you. Director Klein, I want to turn to you now. Can you talk a little bit about the legal considerations in carrying out the U.S.-Israeli attack on Iran?
When Dr. Edgar asked me to do this, I said, no, I don't want to do it. And then when he said, you have to go second and talk for 10 minutes, I said, no, I want to go last, and I want to talk for less than 10 minutes. And the reason, as my students will know, it's not because I'm reluctant to talk, but it's because I think most of us have a sense that law is not in the driver's seat here. And that intuition is right. That intuition is right. The more interesting question then, is it legal, I think, is what role is law playing here? That being said, I have been instructed to do a basic laydown of the law for everyone, recognizing that most of you are not law students. Some of you are. Some of you are. This may be on the exam, so pay attention. But for those of you who are not, we'll keep it high level, and then we'll talk about what is the actual significance of any of this in this fast-moving geopolitical crisis. Okay, so if you sit down to do the legal analysis, there are two questions. Some of you know this from class, and you have to analyze them separately. The U.S. Constitution, and can the president do this unilaterally without a vote by Congress, is question number one. We'll do that first, and then we'll do international law. And we're doing this quick and dirty, very high level. So under Article 2 of the Constitution, the president is commander-in-chief of the Army and the Navy and the rest of the armed forces, which were created later. So the question is, does that mean the president has the authority to order the armed forces to do anything that they could conceivably do? Or simply that he has tactical command of the armed forces once we're at war? The other important part of the Constitution is Article 1, which gives powers to Congress, especially here the power to declare war. Well, the big question is, what does declare war mean? And the original meaning of that, and by original meaning I mean when the Constitution was drafted and ratified, what was it understood, publicly understood to mean, is hotly debated. Does it mean that if we get into a war against a foreign state, only Congress can push the start button, push the go button, by passing a declaration of war, or in modern parlance, an authorization for the use of military force? Or does it refer to an outmoded, archaic legal custom of formally declaring yourself to be in a state of war? So imagine an 18th century diplomat with a powdered wig and stockings handing some gold embossed piece of paper to the diplomats of another nation and slapping them with a white glove and saying, I hereby declare us to be at a state of war with you. And some people say it's that, and that it's actually no longer functionally significant. And other people, and I think there's pretty good support in the founding era, say no, the founders did not want the president, like the British king, to be able to take us unilaterally to war for capricious or personal reasons. They wanted the grave question of war and peace to be deliberated by the people's legislature. Okay, that's a legal debate that is one, obviously, in theory, of great significance. In practice, for reasons we'll discuss later, it is not driving the bus right now in terms of decision-making in this crisis. But that's the constitutional debate here in the United States. Is it a war which Congress has to declare, or is it a commander-in-chief action that the president can take unilaterally? Now, we're not writing on a blank slate here. There's a lot of things that have been done in the past 30, 40 years that create precedent. So going back to 1989, which I think is one of the first geopolitical events that I actually remember, Operation Just Cause in Panama.
I remember the guy with the wig slapping the guy.
Okay, there you go. You got it all up here. The generational spectrum. And General, you may remember better than I, but something like 20,000 ground troops introduced into Panama in Operation Just Cause, President George H.W. Bush. And we dislodged the regime of General Manuel Noriega, who was involved in drug trafficking and all kinds of other bad stuff. Then Kosovo, President Clinton with an air campaign against the government of Serbia. Perhaps most on point is the Libya operation in 2011, where Libya had not for a long time undertaken any hostile action toward the United States. It had undertaken terrorism in the 80s. But President Obama ordered U.S. forces to support an international operation for humanitarian reasons in Libya. The U.S. forces launched more than 600 missiles and precision-guided bombs at Libyan forces. It was a sovereign state adversary. It led directly to regime change. Again, there was no immediate threat to the United States. Certainly, Libya at that time had less recent U.S. blood on its hands than Iran does. Iran killed something like 600 U.S. soldiers in Iraq through its proxy networks. Recently, Iranian proxies have shot drones at U.S. bases in the Middle East, killing U.S. service members. And yet, the Obama administration took the position in a long and well-reasoned opinion from the Justice Department's office that writes these things, saying that the president had authority as commander-in-chief because there were no ground forces introduced, because of the scope and duration of the operation were limited. This was something that the president could do. And I'll just note that the Speaker of the House at the time, Speaker Pelosi, said, yep, president can do this, hands off for Congress, we don't need to authorize this. And I'll let you all make your own judgments about the degree to which partisan affiliations lead to shifting opinions on questions of the balance of executive and congressional power among people on all sides. Another factor here is the who started it question. It's accepted that if someone attacks us, the president, as commander-in-chief, has authority to direct U.S. forces to respond. So unlike a squabble between 5-year-olds, who started it actually matters. If you can persuasively demonstrate that the other side started it, then there's a more credible case for unilateral presidential authority to respond. And here, there are points to be argued. I mean, you can certainly make a case that Iran has been an ongoing campaign of hostilities against the United States for some time. On the other hand, if you were taking the other side, you might argue, why now? Why is this the moment when we had to react with overwhelming force? I leave that to you. Your judgment is as good as mine. Very briefly on international law. So the key legal rule here, and this is the law between states, by the way. This is separate from our U.S. constitutional debate. So we've jumped the tracks. We're now in international law. Forget about everything I just told you. The basic rule comes from the United Nations Charter, which is a treaty that the United States has ratified. So it is a binding legal obligation that the United States has assumed. And its basic rule is that states pledge to refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. Now, there's a critical exception to that rule for self-defense. So there are two factors here that I think would influence the analysis. One is this self-defense? Can this plausibly be characterized as self-defense given this series of hostile acts that Iran has engaged in against the United States? I forgot to mention, by the way, the attempted assassinations of President Trump, other former U.S. officials, Iranian diplomats in the United States. Again, there's no court that's going to decide this. So the question is, does the world community find it persuasive that these things give rise to a claim of self-defense? The other factor here is that it's quite implausible for Iran to claim the protection of this principle after having systematically undermined the territorial integrity and political independence of pretty much every other country in the region going back decades, funding proxy networks, turning Lebanon from the state of the Lebanese people into effectively a foreign operating base for the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. And we now see, actually, in the past couple days, the Lebanese government and armed forces coming out strongly against Iran's attempts to enlist Hezbollah and thereby Lebanon in this campaign. And it seems to be having, again, disastrous results for the people and state of Lebanon for having done that. Syria, another example where Iranian proxies in Syria, Hezbollah specifically, killed hundreds of thousands of Syrians in the civil war there. So Iran's violation of this principle at every step has proved disastrous for the peoples of the region. So it would be a bit ironic for them to shelter behind that. Now note what's missing from this international law discussion. The 30,000 Iranians who were massacred, mostly teenagers, educated young people like many of you sitting here, who came out with unbelievable courage, with no weapons, and stood up to goons and thugs who shot them down, beat them down, murdered them in the hospitals, tortured them. That is, I think, something that is going undiscussed largely in the public narratives about this. the tens of millions of Iranians who have suffered under this regime. It's not a factor in the legal analysis, at least in orthodox international law. Humanitarian intervention, which the U.S. has on occasion asserted in the past, is not universally accepted as a basis for violating the territorial integrity of another state. But I do think it's very important that we remember that as a factor relevant to the legitimacy of this operation, if not its legality. Okay, wrapping up. I have here a post by the great Jack Goldsmith. Some of you may know him. He wrote our casebook for foreign relations law, Kaylin. I see you nodding there, from last year. And the post says, it's called, "Law is irrelevant to the U.S. attack on Iran, and Congress is on the hook as much as the president." You can't write that on the exam, by the way. So why is he saying that? We know that law is not driving this. At most, it is a factor invoked in support of the legitimacy of the operation or against the legitimacy of the operation. Now, why does he say Congress is on the hook as much as the president? Congress built, funded, and handed the president the most powerful military in the world, has passed statutes and appropriations authorizing us to base these forces in all kinds of vulnerable and strategically relevant places around the world. Congress has passed very few restrictions on how that military will be used, perhaps for good reason, and has shown no willingness or ability to enforce any red lines around presidential notification or presidential going to Congress for consent. The international environment moves fast. Congress today moves very slow. It's very difficult for the process of legislation to keep up. And of course, partisan allegiance prevails in every instance over institutional allegiance nowadays. This is not a situation that President Trump created. The Libya example shows that very well. But this is the logical endpoint of a path that we as a republic have been traveling down for some time.
Thank you. General Brooks, to turn to you now, could you characterize the operation for us?
Absolutely. First, it's a delight to be with this panel, as always, with Paul and Adam and Steve with their experiences, and Alexandra as well. Thanks for moderating. It's as I think back to my senior year as a cadet at West Point that began in 1979, ended in 1980. That's about when this problem started with the Islamic Revolution in Iran as they seized the United States Embassy in Tehran. And we've been on a collision course with periodic collisions ever since. Without doubt, in my full career of time, just ending in 2019, a few years ago, Iran was the perpetual problem. It was not the Soviet Union, which seemed to be the biggest problem when I was first commissioned. But the perpetual problem was the Islamic State in Iran. And so this is in many ways a fulfillment of a long-running story. And as with much of history, which runs on a continuum, this particular action is an inflection point in that long-running continuum. And it will leave the Middle East different than it has been up to this point in time. So let me just talk a little bit about the operation. As Paul Edgar introduced, in 2011 to 2013, I was commanding the army forces of the central region, ranging from Egypt to Kazakhstan. So this was a problem set for us back then, to be sure. And while we were still engaged in Iraq and Afghanistan, reducing in Iraq, building in Afghanistan at the same time, it was very clear we needed to posture ourselves for Iran. How would we deal with Iran, particularly if it got to the point where Iran was threatening all of the Gulf neighbors? And where did we need to be? What kinds of relationships did we need to have? What sorts of capabilities did those states, the Gulf states especially, but also more deeply into Saudi Arabia, as far as Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, what capabilities would they need to have as well? And what I want to say first is our military efforts have been about building these capacities and relationships all the while. And it's really important to understand that as we think about how much do you pay for our military and where are they and why are they there? Often you ask the question once they get engaged in action. But in fact, their presence has made it possible for operations like this to occur. A little bit about the operations. I'd say in broad terms, we have three primary actors engaging in combat action. against one another right now. 3 primary and then several secondary. Israel, trying to reverse an existential threat, the threats against the very state of Israel, communicated principally by Iran and by its network of proxies or other like-minded individuals who they want to support. That's how their foreign minister described it. It was a really weak description. They're proxies. They're the extended arms and fingers of the Islamic Revolution, without a question. And that's been demonstrated over and over again. So Israel is fighting against this existential threat. Iran is now fighting against an existential threat where it felt somewhat secure, but has been, over time, losing more and more capability, as has been highlighted. Each one of these operations, whether it's June last year or back in the spring before that, or back several years, going back to October 2023, going back, et cetera, each one of these has a cumulative effect on reducing some of Iran's capability to project itself abroad. And so we see now a real crescendo with the introduction of the third player, the United States of America, engaging in combat operations in something that has certainly been thought through. This is not a new concept for the military forces in the region, but rather an execution of something that has been thought about, rehearsed, planned, and now implemented over a long period of time. The focus of Israel seems to be very much on attacking the structures of the regime, from the supreme leader himself down into the structures of the regime, its various branches, particularly its security forces, its ability to maintain control on the streets. Those structures are being attacked in large way. The leadership, the ability to command and control, the ability to make decisions. For example, there's an assembly of experts, a group of 88 clerics who decide who the supreme leader is going to be. And they know that that's their role. Normally they meet once a year, but they tried to meet 2 days ago. And the building where they would meet was blown up right before their meeting. Whether they were in it or not is still yet to be determined, whether that effect directly impacted that assembly of experts. That's just an example of a strike against a specific part of the regime's capability. And that effort now is advancing rapidly. So Israel has increased the pace on doing this. The amount of missiles and ordnance and bombs dropped in just the last 5 days is far greater than the amount dropped in the 12-day war last June. They've dwarfed that already. So this is a very, very concentrated effort to destabilize the regime. Now, is this a regime change operation? I don't know. Certainly, there's been allusions to that. In fact, it is destabilizing to the regime and may cause the regime not to be able to survive, whether it's from internal upheaval or from just the degree of losses and the inability to reorganize itself. Iran is focused on the economies of the Gulf region and the globe. So their counterstrike is about economy. That's why they're striking not only the places where the U.S. had forces based, from Iraq through Kuwait to Saudi Arabia to Qatar to Bahrain to the United Arab Emirates to Oman to Jordan to Israel and even to Cyprus. And all of these have been struck by Iran over the last few days. An extraordinary reach that demonstrates the capacity they actually had with long-range missiles and with drones that are being used in a much more significant way than ever before. But their additional focus and beyond the military bases has been on economic centers, airports, oil refineries, transport locations, these sorts of things, because they're trying to inflict a degree of pain on the global economy that causes someone to say, stop, 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 we've had enough. Stop what you're doing. And so that causes an acceleration then by Iran to try to increase the amount of pain while Israel is increasing the effects on the regime. Iran is no longer able to maintain central control of its operations. That has been disabled. But now you have a devolution of authorities down into even governor levels to be able to take actions that they deem necessary. And that might include launching missiles. And so this devolution will stabilize at some point nearby, in the near future. And then the American focus has been largely against the nuclear industry, the missiles that are able to cause this reach to affect economy and to affect our bases abroad. Some additional targets against the regime, a particular focus on the Iranian Navy, especially the Revolutionary Guards Corps Navy, and also the regular Navy. Says Iran has two military forces. The Revolutionary Guards, which they use for expanding the ideals of the revolution, including distantly abroad. And there's also their regular forces who maintain security of their coastline, maintain their territorial integrity, but also for their army, maintain security on the streets. These are being attacked by U.S. forces to dismantle their ability to project any kind of power abroad and to resume now the free flow of oil and commerce through the northern Arabian Gulf, as Americans refer to it. Iran refers to it as the Persian Gulf, through the Strait of Hormuz, out into the Indian Ocean, and back around to the Red Sea or across to the East Indian Ocean, crossing into the Pacific. This is an extremely important area for commerce for the rest of the world. The United States is not dependent on it, but the rest of the world is. This is what the U.S. is working to peel back, taking the capability of Iran away from being able to do these things. And that's why you hear all this emphasis on their Navy. In a few days, we'll probably see some stabilizing of this. We're already seeing a significant reduction in the number of missiles being launched by Iran, the number of drone attacks that are occurring, and their effects in some of the adjacent countries. But there's already an economic effect that we see happening in the rising price of oil, in the temporary suspension of underwriting for vessels that flow through the Arabian Gulf. All these things have consequences that will be felt for a period of time. Inflation will occur in lots of countries around the world beyond the ones that are being struck. So this effect is much broader and should be thought of this way. Next point I want to make is that the nature of this operation, the term air war comes up every now and then, or air campaign. There really is no such thing in modern military parlance for the United States. We operate as a joint force. All elements of the joint force are involved in this operation. So whether it's long-range precision fires being conducted by Army elements, ground-based air and missile defense, which has been critically important, provided by the Army, the air efforts being conducted by the Air Force and the Navy, strike operations coming from naval vessels afloat in the Arabian Gulf and elsewhere, whether it's space forces that are conducting everything from surveillance to cyber operations to maintaining networks. All the services are involved. Special operations are involved. And beyond the military joint force, we have the broader parts of the U.S. government. The intelligence community is very, very busy right now. And they're absolutely critical in what has been unfolding. Whether it's the precision for where Israel did its strikes or where we find the Iranian Navy located as they try to get away from their original bases, including where their vessels are located out beyond and in international waters, as we saw an American submarine sink one of their combatant vessels just in the last 24 hours. This is intelligence also. So think of it very differently than we have historically talked about it. There's no air war, then ground war. These things are gone. They're constructs of the past for the United States. That is not the case for others, but that's absolutely the case for the United States and is part of our special power. Quite honestly, it's one of the things we have that others do not have. And so I've talked a little bit about the regime and its structure. I've talked about the nature of joint operations and the long continuity that brings us to this point in time. We'll see if this begins to change direction in a few days. Let me just take a few seconds to talk about some of the strategic implications for the region. The big play here, in my opinion, is the relationship among three Islamic centers of influence and also the relationship between the Mideast region and Israel. These are the two big pieces that are in play. The three centers of Islamic influence are Iran, which has hijacked Shia Islam. It's not the original center of Shia Islam, but has hijacked it through a political Islam brought about by the 1979 revolution. Saudi Arabia, which is a center of Sunni Islam, but accused by the Shia as also the source of Wahhabist extremist ideology. And Turkey needs to be considered as the third among these three, which is balancing its considerations of Islamism versus secularism. So will this create a condition where there's a new shifting of weight? Next, will there be a new relationship between Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, and Israel? And I think that candidly is the big jewel that is in the eyes of the current U.S. administration and the Israeli administration, as well as the Saudi Crown Prince, that this new relationship will change the international order in the Middle East. And it can't occur as long as Iran exists as it has under the Islamic Revolution. So will this revolution end with this operation that we see unfolding, or will it regenerate itself? Will there still be a projection of a revolutionary Islamic power in the form of the Revolutionary Guards Corps and its proxies, or will those now be reduced for the first time since 1979 in a way that they're no longer effective in the ability to stabilize or destabilize governments and regions? That's what's in play right here. And it's a big strategic play, and it has potential to fail. And military instruments alone cannot accomplish this. There are limits to what military power can do. It sets conditions, but it cannot finalize the outcome. And so it's yet to be seen whether this will be a success or an abject failure.
Thank you. Let's turn now to intelligence. Professor Slick, you were COS for Tel Aviv, spent a lot of time working with the Israelis. I'm curious in your thoughts of Israeli involvement as well as the intelligence operations surrounding the military operation.
Sure. Thanks very much, Alexandra. And thanks to the Strauss and Clements Center for pulling this together on short notice. It's a lot of fun and important to do. I apologize in advance, as Paul did earlier, for sticking fairly closely to my script. And I'll be honest with you, that's for my protection and a little bit of yours. But mainly it's to ensure that we have some time left at the end for the student questions, and I'm glad so many of you turned out. I'll start first by maybe modestly challenging one of the emerging pieces of conventional wisdom about all this, that it's incredibly important and will be memorable from a historical standpoint. I'm not so sure. The joint U.S.-Israeli airstrikes are certainly notable to the extent they involve serious physical, commercial, and diplomatic risk. But depending on what takes place in the next 2 weeks, I'd suggest there's a non-zero chance that all this ends quite inconclusively, with the Islamic Republic still ruling Iran and committed more than ever to developing weapons that will deter future attacks on its territory. It's even possible that in several years we'll look back on this military operation as just one in a series of external attacks on strategic targets inside Iran that started last June with 2 weeks of continuous attacks by Israel and U.S. forces and continues today. I was asked to say a word, as Alexandra said, about Israel's broader approach to its security and also describe a few of the intelligence issues that I see implicated in all this. Israel's interest in decapitating the Islamic Republic's leadership, degrading its ballistic missile stocks, and preventing a restart of the nuclear program is long-standing and consistent. For decades, Israel's primary security threat has been the terrorism conducted by regional proxies that we've already discussed: Hamas in Gaza and the West Bank, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen. The horrific October 7th, 2023 attacks by Hamas in southern Israel punctuated for Israel the futility of fighting with the proxies while their Iranian sponsors enjoy safe haven behind an international border, while the Iran was at the same time moving steadily toward a military nuclear capacity. Israeli security officials who talked about a never-ending war between the wars, a periodic mowing of the grass, an expression I really dislike, have now shifted to the rhetoric of cutting the head off the snake, right? Choose your metaphor. In the post-October 7th climate of fear and vulnerability, Israeli leaders planned for attacks inside Iran and looked for opportunities to change the regime in Tehran. The red line against direct military attacks inside Iran was crossed last June, when the U.S. joined in attacks against air defense and nuclear targets and helped Israel defend against Iran's retaliation. Israeli strategists regard the installation of a new regime in Tehran, one that recognizes Israel, renounces nuclear weapons, and ends support to terrorism, as essential to Israel's long-term security. The American administration apparently agreed with Prime Minister Netanyahu and is pursuing this joint air campaign against Iranian government targets. I mentioned Israel's embattled Prime Minister, Bibi Netanyahu, but it would be a mistake to attribute this policy of aggressively confronting Iran solely to the leader of a right-wing government. in Jerusalem. Israeli society is deeply divided on many issues, but there's widespread support for the need to neutralize the threat posed by the Islamic Republic. With respect to intelligence matters, I'll move quickly through several of these. Any decision by a U.S. president to undertake a major military operation overseas inevitably includes a role for our large and highly capable intelligence community. Even for a chief executive who's openly dismissive, or at least highly skeptical, of our intelligence agencies, it's safe to assume that intelligence information and judgments from our IC were produced and consumed not only by the military planners and operators, but also likely by the president and his senior advisors. This intelligence work is and should remain hidden from public view. But in the fullness of time, it will be important to study the IC's work on this conflict and learn lessons from what proved to be accurate, insightful, and influential intelligence we may have provided, and also what IC information and assessments may have been flawed or misleading or unhelpful. In this regard, there are already signs that intelligence produced to support the president and his advisors is beginning to leak, with the aim of shaping the coming public debate over the wisdom, motives, and timing of this operation. I encourage you all as students to ignore these politically motivated leaks of individual intelligence reports or unheeded intelligence warnings. They're invariably distorted or at least taken out of context. And the cable news debates about classified intelligence reports only makes the IC's job harder and further erodes the trust that must exist between the producers of intelligence and the consumers who are ultimately elected and responsible for keeping us safe. There are at least three categories of intelligence that would likely have been produced in support of this major military action: strategic assessments, tactical intelligence reporting, and possibly covert influence directives. I'll touch on them very quickly. The IC would be asked to generate, or more likely to update, existing intelligence assessments on strategic questions, like the status of Iran's nuclear program, the regime's likely response to an Israeli or joint U.S.-Israeli attack, the expected public and private responses by key regional states, the loyalty of Iran's army, police, and other secular security organs, and likely succession scenarios if the supreme leader were killed, as he apparently has been. The demands for tactical intelligence, as General Brooks mentioned, to support a large-scale air campaign like this one are enormous. The Pentagon claimed several days ago that more than 1,000 discrete targets had been struck and that hundreds more would be attacked and destroyed in the coming days. Each of these targets is supported by a targeting package informed by all-source intelligence that helps determine the time and manner of attack, the assigned munition, and this is all followed up by imaging and formal bomb damage assessments of the effectiveness of attacks. Rinse and repeat, right? Finally, we can speculate about the possibility of U.S. efforts to shape conditions, that's a term of art, some of you will recognize it, inside Iran in favor of our preferred outcomes. While the intelligence community's primary role is to inform the decisions of our elected and appointed leaders, U.S. law allows the president to issue a written order to the CIA director authorizing him to shape conditions abroad in support of identified U.S. policies. Students, and I see several of you here from our Covert Action Seminar, are familiar with these procedures, as well as the CIA's very mixed track record of executing presidential findings. But if such a written order existed to support the military operation against Iran, we could speculate about whether the U.S. is already engaged or has been engaged for some period of time in secret activities to weaken, splinter, or deceive the regime, or to bolster specific operation groups or leaders. None of us knows if CIA was assigned a covert action mission in this conflict. But again, in the fullness of time, this will be a question that will be asked, and we can evaluate the performance of U.S. intelligence in the overall scope of the 2026 U.S.-Israeli attacks on the Islamic Republic. We should not, though, hold our breath on learning more about these covert action questions, since the official records on Operation TP Ajax, which some of you know is the overthrow of the Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953, were not declassified and disclosed to the public for almost 60 years, more than half a century earlier this century. So with that, I'll surrender the stage and look forward to the questions.
Thank you. So I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and ask 2 or 3 questions and then open the floor to you all. This is a question for Director Klein, but General Brooks, I would welcome your thoughts on this as well. Operation Epic Fury has targeted Iran's missile launchers, stockpiles, and drones. Yet since Saturday, Iran has launched as many as 2,000 drones, according to New York Times reporting. The U.S. and Middle Eastern countries have intercepted most of them, but interception is not free. A single Shahed drone costs Iran as little as $20,000, whereas a Patriot interceptor missile costs approximately $4 million US. And US stockpiles, I should add, are not unlimited. Are we already witnessing the limits of expensive high-end defense systems against cheap, mass-produced attrition weapons? And I'd also invite you, if you're willing, to address the harder downstream question, which is, does the U.S. have the industrial base and capacity to replenish these armaments at this pace?
The answer to the last question is easy. Not yet. We need to run as fast as we can to be able to make more of these things much more quickly. The administration knows that. They're grabbing the defense contractors, banging heads together, and trying their best to simulate that. There are a lot of people in Austin working on these problems as well. The cost exchange issue, whereby you use something expensive to shoot down something cheap, is important, but I think it can be a little overstated. We have, I don't want to say infinity money, but lots of money, to the point where we could be dropping barrels of money instead of bombs on Iran and still keep the operations going relative to Iran. So we are a very wealthy country. We should use expensive things to defend our forces, our ships, our allies. The second question is, what are you defending with the $1 million interceptor missile? If you're defending a ship that costs hundreds of millions or multiple billions of dollars, or a skyscraper that costs hundreds of millions of dollars, that's a great trade, and keep doing it. The third point is, as I understand it, in most cases, you don't need a Patriot missile to shoot down a Shahed drone, which is slow, very loud, not stealthy at all. These things can be shot down with fighter aircraft, and that's why there are fighter aircraft patrols circling around all over the Middle East right now, including by countries that are not taking part in the offensive operations. We've developed, the U.S. and the defense industry have developed low-cost laser-guided rockets that are very cheap, cheaper than the drone, that can be used to shoot these things down. You can use gun-based defenses that are targeted with radar and AI to shoot these things down. The Ukrainians, big difference, have developed low-cost ways to shoot these Shaheds down, which we can learn from, presumably are learning from. The Israelis have fielded a laser defense system to defeat drones called Iron Beam that has just become operational in the last few months. So it's an important question. I think it's slightly overstated. There are some other interesting technology innovations that I've seen in what's been publicly available so far on the U.S. side. We are using a hacked version of the Shahed drone on our side. We copied the design, we domesticated it. We said, this thing kind of works. We put U.S. electronics in it, better engine, better systems, and we fired a lot of these things into Iran, apparently. And they are much more efficacious for us than they are for the Iranians, because the Iranians have no air defenses. So you can send something that's pathetically slow, loud, and obvious into a country with no air defenses, and it can precisely hit its target for much less than the cost of flying an F-35 over and dropping a precision-guided bomb on the same thing. So that's an example of us innovating, hacking our way down the cost curve, and we fielded that system very quickly, as I understand it, and I think that's commendable. And then another point, which perhaps General Brooks can talk about, is the post-intermediate, post-INF treaty missiles that the Army has been firing in combat for the first time. Maybe you can talk about that. That's a very significant development enabled by the treaty that we exited, perhaps controversially in some quarters, about 10 years ago, that prohibited us from developing those missiles.
Yeah, I love all your points. The drone question often comes up. So certainly we see drones being used in a much more significant volume than in recent years, with the exception of the Ukraine-Russia war, where they really took off quite a bit. It's not the first introduction of drones by any means. The reverse engineering, thanks for raising that, Adam, of taking a Shahed, making it better, and then firing at the Iranians is absolutely something that's been going on here. The effort to metaphorize it a bit is thinking about whether you want to spend all of your time trying to block arrows that are being fired at you and deflect stones that are being thrown with the arrows, because there's a combination of things being fired on these countries, or whether you want to kill the archer and kill the stone thrower so they can't throw any more stones. That's the effort that's actually being undertaken. So there has to be a defensive effort first that's done with layered air and missile defense. It's ground-based, it's sea-based, it's directed energy, it's laser, it's cyber, it's all these things in layers joined together by an alert warning system that ties together several countries. It's actually a remarkable arrangement that's occurred in the Gulf states, and it's taken about 20 years to build that. And so you'll see Kuwaiti aircraft that are putting up a cap over top of Kuwait, and Emirati aircraft and Emirati terminal high altitude air defense that was sold to them by the United States 10 years ago. All these things are now layered and integrated with one another. It's pretty remarkable. So there's not cost calculation that really should enter into this, in my opinion. Certainly if it's a one-on-one, then you can see why that question would come up. But when you talk about going against a layer, there's still air defense on the west side of the Gulf. There is no air defense on the east side of the Gulf. Consequently, as Adam just said, anything that we send can reach its target if it's precisely guided. The long-range fires part that you just brought up, thanks for raising that as well. And I alluded to it a bit earlier as one of the contributions being made by the land part of the joint force. This is essentially it's a modernized long-range surface-to-surface missile that is launched by Army forces, replacing what some may be familiar with, the Army Tactical Missile System, or ATACMS, which really came into play during Desert Storm 35 years ago. But it's still been in use the whole time. Well, the range has been extended. The payload has been changed. The number you can carry at a given point in time in the same chassis has been multiplied. The smartness of the warhead has been increased significantly so it can guide itself to target. And the difference in range, for example, just to put it in context, is if the previous version was able to fire from Austin to Dallas, and that's about the range. By the way, the Strait of Hormuz is the distance from here to Round Rock. It's very narrow. So being able to shoot from here to Dallas is to reach deeply into Iran's territory. The newer version, long-range precision strike, allows you to fire from Austin to Amarillo. Or instead of Austin to Corpus, it's Austin to Monterrey, Mexico. That's the range difference. It's another 200 kilometers on top of a 300-kilometer range. And so that expands the options available to strike deep into the territory of Iran and to have a very specific effect on a target with a strong payload that can make a difference. That's one less aircrew. That's one less very expensive missile that comes off the rail of an aircraft. They have to fly back to their base and reload. It's one less missile coming out of a magazine of a naval destroyer in the Gulf. So it's one more arrow that is added and one more danger that's been provided there. So this is modernization happens in warfare. And you see technologies that have been designed and experimented in the interim now being applied and being improved thereafter for whatever comes next.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask one more question. This is for Professor Pope and for Professor Slick. On Truth Social, Trump boasted about the sophistication of the U.S. and Israeli intelligence and tracking systems in killing Khomeini. He said there's not a single thing that the leader could have done to have hidden from the U.S. intelligence service. But reports suggest he died in his office at the start of the Iranian work week. So there was no bunker, no evasive movements in a predictable location. Does that tell us more about the limits of Iranian protective security than it does about American or Israeli capabilities? And what does it say about the Iranian leadership's threat assessment? Did they simply not believe that they were genuinely at risk?
Well, I think that must be true, that they were at least underestimating it. I think that, they knew they were in a crisis. That's why they were going to meet. But what I was trying to describe earlier was I believe that we had not communicated to them how serious we were about some of the things that the red lines that we had. And, we have gone to there's been periods where we've had these kind of tensions before, where we've said this is unacceptable, but we accepted it. And this time, that's not what's happening. So I don't know if it was a matter of routine, a matter of, I don't know. I have no insight on that. I do know that it's pretty impressive that they were tracking this carefully, what was going on. And I don't know all the details on that. I'd like to. I think that's an interesting offshoot, or flows out of the manhunting that we learned to do after 9/11 and the kind of skill sets that we developed with teams of people, not just operations officers collecting information, but entire teams of integrating all source, but also augmented by sources on the ground. So it was an impressive thing. I don't know the answer from the Iranian perspective. I think it was a pretty dumb idea to go to the office.
I'll associate myself with Paul's reaction to that. I can't explain it. I think ultimately it was a miscalculation on their part, a strategic diplomatic miscalculation. They clearly didn't believe that Israel, or Israel with the permission, likely that conversation was held with the President of the United States, were willing to kill the supreme leader of the Islamic State of Iran while negotiations were underway and before hostilities had commenced. Now, that may be in the history and context of manhunting and Israel's record of decapitating skills and leaders from enemy programs. I'm thinking of the death of Qasem Soleimani, the IRGC Quds Force commander, the death of Hassan Nasrallah, the Hezbollah leader, the decimation, decapitation of the Hezbollah leadership through that incredibly creative pager and walkie-talkie operation. Clearly, we're very good at this. The Israelis are at least as good, if not better. And we've always given credit to the MOIS and the IRGC, the security forces in Iran, for being smart and good at what they do, somewhat restricted by resources, somewhat restricted by ideology, but damn good at what they're asked to do. And this is an exception to that. I think it's a miscalculation that they ended up costing the life of the supreme leader. And you can tell it was a celebrated success because the U.S. and Israeli security services are now busy through proxies trying to get credit for having come up with it's clearly one of the high points of this military operation so far. And so through proxies, the intel services are squabbling over who gets credit for it, which is welcome to Washington.
Well, perfect. So I'm going to open the floor now to questions from you all. We have 2 mics that are going to come around. So just please hold your questions until the mic is in front of you so that everybody can hear it. I'm going to go for a question in the front here, please.
Thank you so much. Daniel Pate, Aerospace Engineering, Klein 2 Honors Major. In what ways could U.S. involvement in Iran distract attention from China and the Indo-Pacific? And then conversely, how could the U.S. disruption of Iranian oil supplies potentially, harm China's ability to continue to operate in various different domains in the Indo-Pacific?
General Brooks, maybe.
I'll take a run at that. Does it distract from focus on China? Temporarily. But remember, we in the United States have a global system of military commands that are focused geographically. And I can assure you that Admiral Paparo hasn't diverted his attention at all, other than to be concerned about whether he has to release any assets or munitions, for example, to this other region while you have a hot war going on. So his focus has not changed. And therefore, the U.S. is not distracted by this, because they have a portion of the United States security apparatus that is continuously focused on this, as well as a series of intelligence structures that are focused on this as well. Are there resources available right now? That's a different story. We can conduct operations in 2 places simultaneously. Some of you may have seen operations occurring in the U.S. Southern Command area just within the last few days in Ecuador. And this just comes on the tail of operations in Venezuela. And then there's operations in Iran. Now there's what's next. The United States is able to operate on a global scale. Okay, so it's not a diversion of consequence. It is certainly a diversion of political attention and informational focus. No doubt about that for now. What's in the minds of the American body politic and the global body politic. As it regards the economic implications for China, China is one of the most dependent countries on Iranian oil. So that's their primary source of oil flow. They have a supply of their own. Some of that is discount purchased oil from the Russian flows, even those that have been under sanctions. So they've built up their stocks over several years and will be fine for a while. But that will probably at some point require them to institute some state policies restricting things that are consumers, the consumption. There'll be controls that are applied by the Chinese Communist Party to make this period last longer so that there is not a dangerous implication for them that manifests visibly beyond China. It might be felt internally, but they're not going to let that go outside. In the meantime, what happens? There's oil already en route. So what happens to that oil? I would not be at all surprised if we didn't see an impounding of any Iranian oil, Iranian-sourced oil, on a global scale over the next week. That's just simply taken off the market, probably under U.S. control, like Venezuelan oil has become, at which time the United States can determine who gets oil and who doesn't. And that will be used for economic leverage here, and I think the very near future. That's just my estimation.
Shall we take another question? Let's see. Let's go in the back, Rendon.
Hi, my name's Rendon. I'm a second-year MGPS student. My question is more for Professor Pope and Professor Slick, but anyone can really answer. Yesterday, CNN reported that the Trump administration and the CIA are working to arm Kurds in Iran and neighboring countries. It kind of brought to mind reports from the administration earlier this year in 2025 about the CIA infiltration in Venezuela prior to that happening. I guess I was curious about this administration's stance towards the CIA and the publication of the CIA's activities. How do you think this undermines the CIA's ability to work in Iran? And do you see potential consequences because of the publication of this information?
Well, I'll at least offer unequivocally the fact that we're able to read about that in an American newspaper and discuss it, whether it's true or not true, complete or incomplete, is not good. And it's a reflection of a lack of discipline and maybe some poor judgments by journalists, but they live in their own world. So none of that is good if true. I don't think anybody, including the government in Tehran, would be surprised to learn that both the United States and Israel have long-standing, meaning generations, relationships with various Kurdish families and leaders in that part of the world. And it's not, I'm not taking a risk to note that the Iranians are well aware of their nationalities problem. It's a diverse state. They have Azeris, they have Baluch, they have Kurds. All sorts of people would like to be on their own or somehow outside rule from Tehran. And as I said, to the extent that this article implies that maybe we're fostering that or promoting that or assisting that, splintering, that would have to be done under secret arrangements through a covert action finding, but it doesn't seem implausible to me. But I lament that we're here talking about it.
Yeah, Rendon, I want to speak to it a little bit. I like Steve started off by saying it's not good it's in the paper, but if we're actually doing that, it won't be long before people know, as you said. One rule separate from an intelligence, if you can ever get the Kurds in the fight with you, you want to do that. Okay, they know how to do that. But what this would mean, and you know this from taking Professor Slick's class, is it means that's not foreign intel gathering, that's covert action, right? So it would mean that we had a program to do that. A lot of times the secrets that you're you're not protecting the secret that you're doing it. I mean, when I was on the National Intelligence Council, I was one of the lead analytic people on the war in Afghanistan, and everybody knew we were doing it. But they didn't know a lot of the elements of it. They didn't know the degree that, for example, the Chinese were supplying weapons through Egyptians, through Pakistan, all that's out there now, but protecting those actors that were facilitating that. So a lot of times a story leaks that the CIA is doing something, but that's not really what we're protecting. We're protecting details underneath that.
And this is a little bit of a glimpse into the wilderness of mirrors. We don't know the sourcing on that, or at least I haven't read the article and see how they describe the source. It might be the separatist group themselves who want it known that they have a relationship with the U.S. government, and that can make it wildly inaccurate. Lots of people, lots of interests involved in this. So that's why I encouraged you earlier when I spoke about being skeptical and questioning about things you're reading. It's not helpful.
Let's do you, sir. Let's the mic. Yeah. Yep. Perfect. Thank you.
Hustle.
Chop, chop.
We're actually one behind, but we can do. Yep. Both of you can go. How about we collect 2 questions since we're getting close on time, and then.
Yes, my question is primarily for Professor Klein. Internationally, is this war pretty much the end of the liberal rule-based international order? In 2003, W. Bush at least made the attempt to go to the Security Council to get a vote. I mean, he didn't get it, but at least he went through the motions. But it doesn't appear like this president did that at all. And also, I would mention that this is the second time in less than 12 months that the U.S. and Israel have attacked Iran in the middle of negotiations. So, I mean, who would even consider the U.S. as a neutral partner when it comes to negotiations? And then I guess domestically, you mentioned, of course, the Constitution, Article 2. This president seems to operate under the assumption of l'état c'est moi. He can do pretty much anything he wants. And again, W. Bush 23 years ago at least went to Congress and tried to, create some support in Congress for what he's doing. This president, I don't believe, has even addressed the American people, and we're already in day 5 of this war. So shouldn't we be concerned about what's going on legally?
Let's take one more question. You, sir, in front.
My name is Wheeler. I'm a senior civil engineering major and a Clements Center fellow. I know you guys mentioned possible end states, and was just curious what do you think the desired end state is? And then what do you think is the most realistic end state?
The first question I will address very briefly and just invite the audience to consider the degree to which the liberal international order is an emanation of the fact of overwhelming American military power, and whether the liberal international order would exist absent that fact, which General Brooks so eloquently described. On the domestic point, I'll just very quickly say there's a long track record of us progressively sliding towards greater executive unilateralism in the use of force. And as Jack Goldsmith pointed out, and as the cases that I mentioned pointed out, that has occurred under presidents and Congresses of both parties. And then on the second question, I just want to very quickly mention something that I think we have not gotten to yet. There were millions of people on the streets baying for the demise of the Iranian regime without any push, without any help from us. They went out there of their own volition. The regime is overwhelmingly unpopular. There's a small core of ideologically committed fanatics. Most of the rest of the leadership, based on the best information that I have seen, is in it for the money at this point and their positions. It is basically a giant mafia state where the IRGC runs most of the economy, takes most of the money out of the oil trade. Khamenei's son, who's apparently, supposedly, depending on what you believe on the internet, is the next supreme leader in waiting, has hundreds of millions of dollars stashed in London, flies to London for pricey medical treatments. So all is not what it seems. We cannot forget that there were millions of people out on the streets just a few weeks ago. The president said help is on the way. that's neither here nor there as a justification for the action. But this would not have happened, in my opinion, had it not been for that showing that is highly credible that the Iranians, if they can be sufficiently protected from getting massacred again, are ready to act on their own to get rid of this government.
I want to speak to what I used the term desired end state when I was talking. And, this is, I'm going to get a little bit philosophical with you here. This is like it's not only a tough intel question. Like if you're trying to assess what's going to happen, I'm telling you, that's a fool's errand right now to really trying to predict what's happening. If you get to what Adam's saying, though, what you have to ask yourself is it likely, is it possible or even likely that it would be better than what currently exists? And there are a lot of people that believe that it could be much better than what exists. But what I'll tell you is that revolutions and changes of power like this, extremely hard to predict. I mean, if you look at the Russian Revolution, for example, you have Democrats and others in there trying to establish this revolution, and the hardcore people come out. So you don't really know who's going to come out. I think one of the things that is, as we meter what we're doing, do we want to own that solution or do we want to facilitate a solution? That's the tricky proposition, I think. When you invade like we did Iraq, we owned it. And I think now that's going to be, that is the question. The question you ask is what I was alluding to. And you can see, I'll just give an example. When I was in Iraq in 2004, I was around, and I'd been there in '88, and there were neighborhoods that had Sunni and Shia families living side by side, Sunni and Shias intermarrying, going to the same schools and everything. Within a year or two after the invasion, you didn't see that. You had Shia neighborhoods and Sunni neighborhoods. So how it's going to go in terms of these divisions that Steve was talking about, or other divisions that could emerge, is very difficult to tell. I don't think anybody can, I'm just cautioning against anybody saying this is what's going to happen, because they don't know.
Well, I think we will end it there. Thank you so much, and give a round of applause for her.
Thanks, everybody, for coming. As you're packing up and leaving, let me highlight to you tomorrow, A Revolution to Come, a history of an idea from Thucydides to Lenin, at our same time, 12:15, and this one will be in the William Powers Student Activity Center. Thanks for coming.